Ruth Dyson.
Oh, yes. First, I will commend you on your choice against my colleague who's been competing for longer than I have, actually, and you may not be too popular with you later on, but it's good to be able to have an opportunity to speak to the title and commencement of the Social Housing Reform, Flexible Purchasing and Remedial Matters Bill. I listened with interest to Dennis O'Rourke from New Zealand First, who just made a very substantive contribution, and it is in keeping with the style of the debate on the title and the commencement that we talk about alternative names that this could be called. He quite correctly pointed out that the purpose of this legislation is to continue what the national government has been doing by stealth, which is selling off, hocking off of state houses to the private sector, not so that we can have better provision of affordable houses, not so that we can have more affordable houses, but just solely so the government can get out of that social housing provision and, presumably spend less on supporting vulnerable families. So I commend Dennis O'Rourke's recommendations in terms of the way that the name could be changed. But actually, if you look at the actual name of it, Flexible Purchasing and Remedial Matters, who on earth would know what that means anyway? Flexible purchasing, to the national backbenchers who are going to put their name on the public record alongside this bill, selling off state housing. I'm sure they haven't read it. It's quite obvious that they got to their caucus before the budget and were briefed and were told that this was all about flexible purchasing and remedial matters. They wouldn't have asked. None of them would have had the courage to ask the Minister what it actually meant and what they were going to be voting on and putting their names beside. So even though I agree with Mr O'Rourke and other colleagues who have spoken about changing the name, actually the title is so meaningless that I don't know if it would even matter. But if we want to say what this bill actually does, then we should be much more honest. The spin around the media that has been associated with this legislation is quite extraordinary. The term moving to housing independence, which, presumably in this conservative model that John Key is now promoting, conservative, compassionate model that he's now promoting, presumably that means something. Actually, Mr Twyford's right. What it does mean for many people in state houses is quite literally that they lose their home. It's not just a house that they happen to go to after work, after school every day. It is their home. Might not be as flash as the Parnell mansion, but actually people have a very strong attachment to their home, and people in state houses have every right to maintain that attachment unless we are offering them a better opportunity. Moving to housing independence by telling people that they no longer have the tenancy rights of a state house and they have to go into the private market is not offering them a better choice, but that's all that Paula Bennett and Bill English are offering them. I listened prior to the lunch adjournment to some of my colleagues speaking, and I was actually pretty dismayed at the sniggers and sneers that came from members of the National Party backbench when David Clark was talking about a friend of his who was no longer able to afford to have her hair cut on a regular basis, and her children were paying for that. The rent had gone up to such a point that she didn't have any spare money at all. And they were sniggering about that. David Clark also said, that isn't the New Zealand that I signed up to, and I want to totally endorse those comments. Mr Chairman, when we're talking about what values we have as a society, what's important to us, what makes us proud to be New Zealanders, then it has always been for me that we do have an egalitarian society. We do have people who are respected regardless of their level of wealth or income, people who are considered as part of the community, people who have a stable home to call their own, whether they rent it or whether they own it. They're still contributing members of our community. This bill is another step away from that vision, away from that respect of individuals, away from the ability of New Zealanders to be able to afford to live in a home because the government thinks that subsidising their rent is a priority. Mr Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
John Naylor.